Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox Christianity all trace themselves back to the same Bible, the same early church, and the same original list of people they considered holy. And yet, right now, a Catholic can walk into a church and pray to a saint who died 1,500 years ago, expecting that prayer to reach God. A Protestant would call that practice not just wrong, but potentially dangerous, closer to communicating with the dead than worshipping God. And an Orthodox Christian would say both of them are missing the deeper point entirely. The disagreement isn't just about which names belong on a list. It runs all the way down to what death actually does to a person, whether the dead can hear you, and whether God ever authorized anyone other than Jesus Christ to stand between him and the living. Saint Christopher is a good place to start. For centuries, he was one of the most venerated figures in Western Christianity, patron of travelers, his medal on dashboards across the Catholic world, his feast day on July 25th. Then, in 1969, Rome quietly removed him from the universal Roman calendar. Not because he did something wrong, because the Vatican's Historical Commission concluded there was insufficient evidence he ever existed. The Orthodox Church kept him. The Coptic Church still venerates him. And for Protestants, the entire episode confirmed something they had argued since the 16th century. The system for making saints was never as solid as it appeared. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand what people actually believe, not the surface version, but the theological structure underneath, this channel was built for you. Subscribe and stay with it. Now let's go deeper. The word saint comes from the Latin sanctus, meaning holy or set apart. And here is where the three traditions immediately split, not over doctrine yet, but over vocabulary. In the letters of Paul, the Greek word hagios, holy ones, refers to living Christians. All of them. In his letter to the Romans, he addresses the entire community in Rome as the called saints. In Corinthians, same thing. Sainthood in the New Testament is not a rank you reach after death. It is a description of anyone who belongs to God. Protestants, especially Reformed and Lutheran traditions, never moved away from that definition. A saint is a believer. Every Christian is a saint by virtue of justification, not virtue. There is no graduation ceremony, no post-death elevation, no special category for the exceptional dead. When Protestant churches occasionally refer to someone as a saint, Saint Augustine, Saint Paul, they are using the term historically or descriptively, not making a theological claim about that person's current spiritual activity. Catholicism built an entirely different architecture on top of that same foundation. The word saint still carries the Pauline meaning. In the Catechism, all the baptized are called to holiness. But the Church also developed a formal category for those who have been officially recognized as definitively in heaven and capable of interceding for the living. Canonization is not a declaration that someone might be in heaven. It is an infallible declaration, under the full weight of papal authority, that they are. The distinction matters because it is what gives the faithful confidence to pray to them. Orthodoxy lands somewhere that feels different from both. The theological framework is built around theosis, the process by which a human being participates increasingly in the divine nature, what the Eastern Fathers described as becoming by grace what God is by nature. Saints are not exceptional Christians who earned a title. They are humans who allowed that process of transformation to reach its fullest expression in their lives. Canonization in the Orthodox world is not primarily a juridical act. It is a recognition of something the community has already observed: the fragrance of holiness, the incorruption of the body, the miracles surrounding the tomb. The Church does not create a saint by canonizing them. It acknowledges one. Those three starting points, sainthood as universal category, sainthood as post-death office, sainthood as completed theosis, are what produce every disagreement that follows. The process of making a saint tells you almost everything about how a tradition understands spiritual authority. Rome's procedure is the most elaborate formalized system in the history of religion. It has 5 stages. First, a waiting period of at least 5 years after death, waived for John Paul II and Mother Teresa, which itself generated theological debate. Then the local bishop opens an investigation into the candidate's life and writings. If that passes, Rome takes over and the candidate becomes a servant of God. Then venerable, if heroic virtue is confirmed. Then blessed, after one verified miracle attributed to the candidate's intercession after death. Then saint, after a second miracle, also post-beatification. The miracle requirement is not symbolic. It has to be medically inexplicable. The Vatican's medical board, composed of secular doctors, must conclude that the healing has no natural explanation. Then a separate theological board must conclude it was due to the candidate's intercession specifically, the process that was once prosecuted by a figure called the promoter of the faith, colloquially the devil's advocate, whose job was to argue against canonization, was restructured by John Paul II in 1983. Critics argued this made the process faster but less adversarial. The Vatican canonized more saints in John Paul II's pontificate than in the previous 5 centuries combined. Orthodoxy's path is structurally different at every step. There is no central authority equivalent to Rome's congregation for the causes of saints. Each autocephalous church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Serbian, the Romanian, the Georgian, has its own synod, and canonizations are made by those synods independently. A saint recognized by Moscow may not be formally recognized by Constantinople, though in practice the traditions cross-pollinate heavily. What drives the process is not a legal file built over decades. It is typically a combination of popular veneration sustained over time, reports of miracles at the tomb, and in many cases, the incorruption of the body, the absence of decay, which orthodoxy reads as a physical sign of theosis. The fragmentation becomes even more visible when you account for the Oriental Orthodox churches, the Coptic, the Ethiopian, the Armenian, the Syriac traditions that split from the rest of Christianity after the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has a canon of saints that includes figures Rome has never heard of and never canonized. It also recognizes the entire Old Testament book list differently. Saints like Tekle Haymanot, one of the most venerated figures in Ethiopian Christianity, are unknown in Rome and invisible in Protestant tradition. These are not peripheral figures in their own tradition. Tekle Haymanot is to Ethiopian Christianity roughly what Francis of Assisi is to Italian Catholicism. Protestantism removed the machinery entirely. Luther's argument was not primarily that specific saints were fraudulent. It was that the category of post-death intercessor had no scriptural warrant. Hebrews 9:27. It is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. The dead are dead. They are not active agents monitoring prayers from the living. The system of canonization, from Luther's perspective, was the church building theological infrastructure around a practice that the Bible never authorized. Calvin went further. Praying to saints, in Calvin's framework, was not just theologically unfounded, it was a form of idolatry, a diversion of the worship that belongs exclusively to God. He drew on the prohibitions in Deuteronomy 18 against consulting the dead, and argued that invoking saints was structurally identical to necromancy, even if the practitioners didn't intend it that way. This is the point where the disagreement stops being academic and becomes visceral, because the Catholic and Orthodox response to the necromancy charge is not to concede the premise. It is to reject it completely. The saints are not dead in the relevant sense. They are more alive than the living. They exist in the presence of God, outside of time, in a state of completed existence that makes the term dead technically misleading. Asking a saint to pray for you is not consulting the dead. It is asking a living member of the body of Christ who happens to be on the other side of death to intercede on your behalf, the same way you might ask a living friend to pray for you. That response depends entirely on a particular theology of death and continued personal existence. And it is precisely there that Protestant theology draws a hard line. 1 Timothy 2:5. There is one God and there is one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. 1. Not one primary mediator and a network of secondary intercessors. 1. Now here's what actually sharpens this debate in practice. The Catholic Church officially distinguishes between Latria, the worship due to God alone, and dulia, the veneration given to saints. Hyperdulia sits between them, reserved for Mary. The argument is that Catholics do not worship saints. They venerate them. The linguistic distinction is real and the Catechism is explicit about it. But Protestant critics have argued for 500 years that the distinction collapses in popular practice, that the prayers addressed to saints, the altars, the candles, the medals, the functional role saints play in the daily spiritual life of ordinary Catholics, look structurally like worship regardless of what the theology books say. The Orthodox make a similar distinction. The debate over whether the distinction holds in practice is one that has never been resolved between the traditions and probably never will be. If you grew up Catholic or Orthodox, was the distinction between veneration and worship something you were explicitly taught? Or did you absorb the practice without the theological framework behind it? Drop that in the comments, because that gap between doctrine and practice is exactly where the most honest version of this conversation happens. Some of the most revealing fractures in this debate show up not in abstract theology, but in specific cases, particular human beings whose status differs dramatically depending on which tradition you are standing in. George is a useful example because all three major branches have some relationship to him. The Catholic Church recognizes him, though with a reduced feast status after the 1969 calendar revision. The Orthodox Church venerates him intensely. St. George, the Great Martyr, his feast on April 23rd, one of the most celebrated in the Eastern calendar. For most Protestant traditions, he is simply a historical figure of uncertain biography, useful perhaps as a cultural reference, but carrying no theological weight. Same person. Three completely different relationships. Mary Magdalene is more complex. In the Western tradition, she was conflated for over a millennium with the unnamed sinful woman of Luke 7 and with Mary of Bethany, a conflation Pope Gregory the Fond codified in a sermon in 591, and that shaped her image as penitent sinner for the entirety of the medieval period. The Eastern Church never accepted this conflation. The Orthodox have always distinguished between the three figures, venerating Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles, the first witness of the resurrection, without the overlay of the penitent sinner narrative. Rome officially uncoupled the figures in 1969, the same reform that also removed Christopher, and in 2016 elevated her feast to the level of the apostles, a correction that took 1400 years. Then there are saints who exist only inside specific traditions, and whose recognition has never crossed over. The English and Welsh martyrs, Thomas More, John Fisher, and dozens of others executed under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, were canonized by Rome. They are venerated in Catholic tradition as martyrs who died for the faith. In Anglican tradition, that narrative is complicated by the fact that the opposing side of those executions was the Church of England itself. The Anglican Communion has its own calendar of saints that includes figures Rome would never canonize, and Rome has saints who died. From the Anglican perspective, in a political and theological conflict that looks very different depending on which side you're reading from. And then there is the Protestant case, which does not acknowledge saints officially, but has developed functional equivalents that operate culturally in nearly identical ways. Martin Luther's birthday is celebrated. John Calvin's theology institutes a kind of intellectual veneration of his figure that functions like hagiography. In evangelical and Baptist culture, figures like Amy Carmichael, Corrie ten Boom, or Eric Liddell circulate in exactly the way saints circulate in Catholic culture. Their stories told to model holiness, their lives treated as examples worth emulating, their quotes printed on merchandise. The difference is that no one is praying to them, but the cultural machinery of sainthood is operating anyway. The question of what happens to the body after death reveals a dimension of the saint debate that is easy to overlook if you focus only on doctrine. Relics, physical remains of saints or objects they touched, have occupied a central role in Catholic and Orthodox practice since the earliest centuries of the Church. The Council of Nicaea in 787 affirmed the veneration of relics as part of its broader defense of sacred images. Major churches were built over the bones of martyrs. The possession of a saint's relic was not decorative. It was believed to carry genuine spiritual potency, a contact point between the earthly church and the glorified body of the saint in heaven. The scriptural anchor for this is slim but specific. 2 Kings 13:21 describes a dead man being thrown into Elisha's tomb, touching Elisha's bones, and immediately reviving. That is the text. One verse in the Old Testament. Catholic and Orthodox theologians treat it as evidence that God can work through the physical remains of holy people. Protestant theologians tend to treat it as a historical narrative about God's power, not a prescription for relic veneration, and note that the text says nothing about Elisha's ongoing spiritual agency. It was God acting, not Elisha. The iconoclast controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries was, among other things, a direct confrontation over this question. The Byzantine Emperor, Leo III, ordered the destruction of religious images in 730 AD. The theological argument was that depicting Christ, Mary, or the saints in images was idolatry, the same charge, structurally, that Protestant reformers would make 800 years later. The Second Council of Nicaea restored icon veneration, drawing the distinction between proskynesis, the prostration before icons, and latria, the worship due to God alone. The iconoclasts lost the argument in 787, but the Reformation essentially reopened it in the 1500s, and in much of Protestant Europe, the physical destruction of reliquaries, altarpieces, and saint statues replicated almost exactly what the iconoclasts had done in Byzantium. The bones of saints, the images of saints, the prayers addressed to saints, all of it connects back to a single underlying question about the structure of the universe. Is there a community that includes both the living and the dead? Is death a wall or a threshold? If it is a wall, the Protestant answer follows naturally. The dead are gone. Christ is the only bridge, and the elaborate system built around saint veneration is not just unnecessary, but potentially spiritually dangerous. If it is a threshold, the Catholic and Orthodox answer follows just as naturally. The saints are not gone, they are present in a different mode, and the church that spans both sides of death is a single community with living members on both ends. The Second Vatican Council, in its document Lumen Gentium from 1964, reframed Catholic language around saints in a way that moved noticeably toward the Orthodox framework. Rather than emphasizing the saints as powerful intercessors who mediate specific requests, Lumen Gentium described them in terms of communio, communion, shared life, membership in the same body. Orthodox theologians who read that document noted the convergence. The language of theosis and communion that had always characterized Eastern saint theology was showing up, carefully, in Roman documents. The ecumenical implication was deliberate. Protestantism did not move. The Reformed and evangelical traditions that had rejected the saint system in the 16th century saw no reason in the 20th century to reconsider. The exegetical arguments had not changed. 1 Timothy 2:5 still said one mediator. Deuteronomy 18 still prohibited consulting the dead. The pastoral concern about popular practice collapsing the veneration worship distinction remained exactly as it had been in Calvin's Geneva, which means the debate that produced the Reformation, the specific argument about saints, relics, images, and intercession that sent reformers out of Rome and into the streets of Wittenberg and Geneva and Zurich, is still open. 500 years later, with all of the ecumenical dialogue and theological sophistication developed in the interval, the three major branches of Christianity still cannot agree on what to do with their dead. And the reason they can't agree is that they do not agree on what the dead are.